Have you ever wondered what language Jesus spoke? Was it Hebrew? Was it Aramaic? Was it Greek? Hey, my name is Doug Hamp, and I wrote a book a while ago called Discovering the Language of Jesus. And in the book, I argue that Jesus' mother tongue was Hebrew. Did he know Aramaic? Sure. Did he know Greek? Absolutely. Did he know every language in the world? Well, probably. He was and is God, so he probably knew every language. But I'm asking the question of what language were they speaking in Jerusalem, in Israel at that time in the first century? And I argue that the answer is Hebrew. I want to share with you a interview I just recently did on that very topic. I hope you'll enjoy it and that this will be edifying for you.
Israeli Jews teaching Christians worldwide. Learn deeper, reach higher. Hi, I'm Bob Odell. And in May 2014, when Pope Francis visited Israel, he and Netanyahu had a rare unscripted moment about the language of Jesus. Netanyahu said to the Pope, Jesus was here in this land. He spoke Hebrew. Aramaic, the Pope interjected. Netanyahu responded, he spoke Aramaic, but he knew Hebrew. And then, out of politeness, they immediately went on to other topics. Our guest today is Douglas Hamp, a pro-Israel Christian, author, and radio show host who spent time at Hebrew University in Jerusalem looking at this very issue. What he found after investigating this controversy between Aramaic and Hebrew, which would be the language of Jesus, caused him to write a book on the topic called Discovering the Language of Jesus. Hold on, folks. You may be astounded by what he has to say. Well, hello, Doug. Thanks for doing this interview with us, and how are you doing?
I'm just really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So before you tell the audience who was right, the Pope or Netanyahu, tell us first about the story behind this book. I mean, what was it that led you to get to that moment where you said, I must write a book about this topic?
For me, it's kind of similar to the Incredible Hulk. I have to get kind of mad about something to actually start writing a book. Basically, I keep hearing people say something that I'm like, that's just not true, and so I'm like, okay, I'm going to write a book. And this one, Discovering the Language of Jesus, it all started, I was sitting in a class at a place where I was teaching, and the teacher at the time was saying, somebody asked, what language did Jesus speak? He's like, oh, Aramaic, And, I raised my hand. I'm like, well, what about Hebrew? He's like, oh. And so I went up to him after the class and said, there's a lot of evidence that Jesus spoke Hebrew. He says, oh, did they brainwash you over there in Israel? And that's kind of what made me mad, because I'm like, wait a second, I wasn't the one that was brainwashed here, right? Having lived in Israel, it becomes incredibly apparent to you, just like Netanyahu said, that Jesus spoke Hebrew. And I think it's a very important issue. We can always say, well, it's not a salvational issue, and I get all that. But it is important, okay, because this is our king that we're talking about. This is the one that we follow after. And so just to understand what language he was communicating in, I think is very important. So, yeah, for me it was kind of like that, that slap across the face. I'm like, all right, that does it.
So there are many things in the New Testament that when you read the New Testament, it attributes the various words and phrases in the New Testament to Aramaic, depending on the translation and so forth. So can you give us a good example? Give us an example that's not just a good one for you to explain. Let's take an example of something that has been commonly considered to be Aramaic by almost everyone. Take one of those, and you show us that it was actually Hebrew.
Yeah, actually, it's a great question, and just to let people know, first of all, the Bible says straight up that it was Hebrew. Okay, so we're told when Jesus was crucified that the sign overhead was in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. It doesn't say Aramaic. Okay, John in his book, he says that there was a gate, sheep gate, it's called in Hebrew Okay, Bethesda, right? So in Hebrew, right? He went to this place called the pavement, which in Hebrew is called Gabata, right? And then Jesus was taken to the place of the skull, which is in Hebrew called Golgotha. Okay, again and again, we're told that it's Hebrew. Paul tells us that he heard a voice speaking to him in Hebrew on the road to Damascus. So we're told this repeatedly, and yet people say, no, it doesn't really mean that.
And the Greek word in that case is what exactly?
It's Ebraisti. Okay, so when he says I heard a voice speaking to me in Hebrew, the Greek there is Ebraisti, which means in Hebrew. Okay, so and here's the argument. Well, they didn't have a word for Aramaic. When they said Hebrew, they just really meant to say, when they said Hebrew, they really meant to say Aramaic, okay? And, that's not at all accurate, because they had a word, suristi, which is the word for Aramaic in the Greek language, right? So they had the vocabulary to do that. We know that because Josephus actually uses the word suristi, in his books there on the life and times of the Jews. So, we don't have any question about it. And, if you go to a translation such as the NIV, they're one of the worst, at least in this case. I'm not saying they're always a bad translation, but for this topic they are. Every time it says Hebrew, they simply translate it as Aramaic, and then they put a little footnote that says, well, some people think it's Hebrew, right? But you reading it, you really get the impression that, these scholars must know what they're talking about, right? And the reality is, unfortunately in scholarship, a lot of times people don't investigate something themselves, and we're all guilty of this. I get it, but this is one of these legends that's gotten passed on, and people have not taken the time to go back and look at it. So, in response to your question, let's take a word that people are just absolutely sure this has to be Aramaic, when in fact it's not. And really, I'd say the best example of that is when Jesus was on the cross and he says Eloi. Okay, so if we read it in Mark chapter 15, he says Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, or lama sabachthani, right, how you'd say it there in more English. Whereas in Matthew, he says Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And, this means, of course, my God, why have you forsaken me? So
right.
This phrase doesn't make any sense, okay? It's definitely not Hebrew, right, the way that it's actually written, Eloi, Eloi. It's like, well, where's that coming from? But once you begin to understand what was happening in going from Hebrew to Greek, and of course eventually to English, there are certain constraints that every language has. There's certain things that, you can do in one language, you just can't do in another. And if you try to write that, how would you even do that? Take, for example, in Spanish, you have the R, okay, the double R, right? So it's a R, right? How would you write that in English, right? I mean, we have no way to put that on a piece of paper and say, you're supposed to say a double R here, right? Now, you might have some English speakers who are pretty savvy and they can do the double R, but how would you actually communicate that on a piece of paper where all you know it's English and you're trying to communicate that? You really can't. And, the same thing is true going from, say, English to Spanish. Okay, well, obviously the same thing is going to be true going from Hebrew to Greek. So consider this. Hebrew has what we would call an H sound, as in hotel. They have that letter in the middle of a word. So, for example, the word Elohim, okay?
Right.
Or, so, for example, okay, so how would you then write that? How would you write the word Elohim with Greek letters? Well, you really can't. That's the trouble, is because Greek does not have a way to reproduce that aspirant sound in the middle of their words. They did have something called a rough breathing mark, and they would put that at the front of a word, and they could pronounce kind of an H sound, but nothing in the middle. So now...
And the H sound is all over Hebrew.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's everywhere. It's really everywhere. So to not be able to do that you're going to have some real issues. It's just not going to work. And you're going to have to then basically reduce the letters. Okay. For example, let's take another word that's very popular. Let's take the name of Jesus. Okay. So in Hebrew, if we go all the way back to the book of Joshua, we find it's Yehoshua. Right? Well, try to write that in Greek. You really can't. I mean, because it has two letters that don't exist in Greek. You have the H in the middle, actually 3 letters, excuse me. And you have the sh, that does not exist in Greek. And you have the final letter, ayin, which is a guttural deep in your throat. It's that same sensation when you're about to throw up, that where you kind of feel that way down there. That's where you produce the ayin. And so 3 letters that do not exist, 3 phonemes that do not exist in Greek, how could you possibly say the name Yehoshua in Greek? Well, you just can't, right? So it becomes shortened until we finally get to something like Jesus, okay? And then English is Jesus, right? Because you just can't do it. So we now come back to what Jesus actually said on the cross. And in my book...
My God, why have you forsaken me?
Exactly, yeah. So in the book, I made a table just so everybody can see it all laid together, because what Matthew does is he doesn't say Eloi, Eloi. He actually says Eli, Eli. Now, this is being taken from Psalm 22, okay? Psalm 22:1. That's the original. And there in the Hebrew, it actually says Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. Okay, so that's the original. Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. So from there, you say, okay, well, I can see where Matthew 27:46 says Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Okay, so I'll deal with the other word later, sabachthani. But the words Eli, Eli, those are exactly parallel to what we have in Psalm 22. So what's going on with the book of Mark? I mean, what was Mark thinking?
In other words, why is he saying Eloi rather than Eli?
Right, exactly. Exactly. And I go on to show in the book that the word lama, that's just standard Hebrew, lama. I mean, that's as Hebrew as you can get. Aramaic actually uses the word lamna, so they very possibly, I mean, it would have been really hard to say. They would have said lamna, so we wouldn't expect that to be Aramaic. So the whole phrase isn't really seeming to be Aramaic either. And then the word shvaktani, this is an interesting word, but I'll get back to that one a little bit later. So, okay, so what about Eli or Eloi in Mark 15:34? Well, what I traced it to is that this word, if we go back to the Hebrew and take it back to Elohi, but remember Elohim is actually that's the plural. So if you wanted to make it singular, or if you wanted to make it possessive, I should say, then you would take off the M sound or the mem at the end, and you'd have Elohi. All right, you'd have Elohi.
Right.
So basically, all that's happening here is instead of saying Elohi, you're saying Eloi. All right, because that H doesn't actually fit.
Right. So in other words, it's Elohi, but Greek doesn't have an H, so it's Eloi.
Exactly. I mean, it's really that simple.
It's as simple as that. And that has been considered to be some Aramaic translation.
Yeah, but it's definitely not Aramaic. And I show again in the book that the way you say that in Aramaic, you could say Eli, you could say Elahi, so it would be the A, and Elahi, but you'd never say Elohi. Okay.
Right. Right.
So again, it just doesn't make sense. If it had been Aramaic, he would have said Elai, Elai, but he didn't.
Right.
He said Eloi.
Well,
right?
so you've talked about Eloi, and you've talked about Lama. What about that last word, sabachthani?
When we return, we're going to have to see how Doug gets himself out of a little bit of a jam, because he's going to tell us that that word actually is Aramaic. And after that, I'm going to ask him about why does he think that so many scholars have come to the conclusion of Aramaic. And the answer to that is not only interesting, but it is sobering. See you next time on Root Source. Learn deeper, reach higher.